I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news from across the battlefront and analyse the surprise announcement from the US of a new funding package for Ukraine amid an ongoing ammunition shortage for Kyiv's forces.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, the 13th of March, 2 years and 18 days since the full-scale invasion began, and today I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls and Assistant Comment Editor Dearnley. I started by asking Dom for the latest updates from Ukraine.
Well, hi David, hi everybody. So let's start in the skies and let's start inside Russia. Again, second day running, seems like there's been another very large Ukrainian drone wave, or series of waves if you like, inside Russia. Firstly, a drone was deemed responsible for an attack on the headquarters of Russia's FSB State Security Service in Russia's Belgorod region this morning. This comes from TASS, the news agency. Building was damaged in the incident, but no casualties, TASS report. Then Peter Malkov, who's the governor of the Ryazan region that borders Moscow. Well, so from Moscow, go southeast about 100 k's. There is another oblast before you get to Ryazan, but that's where it's the next one over. So it's up there. Speaking on Telegram, it said the oil refinery there was attacked by a UAV, uninhabited air vehicle, unmanned air vehicle, a drone. He said a fire broke out as a result. That fire is now thought to be out. And then Ukraine's SBU security service is said to have carried out drone attacks on 3 Russian oil refineries in Ryazan, Kstovo and Kryvyi overnight. So they're all in that vicinity within sort of 100 k's-ish of Moscow and Leningrad as part of a... can I say Leningrad? It's not Leningrad anymore. St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg. So it's the old joke. Where were you born? Where did you grow up? Where do you want to be? St. Petersburg, Leningrad, Petrograd, St. Petersburg. Anyway, sorry. Anyway, so a source speaking to Reuters said this is all part of a strategy to reduce Russia's economic potential. The same source said Ukrainian defense forces had conducted overnight drone attacks on a Russian airbase in Bertilinovka. That's a military airfield in Voronezh region, about 100 k's north of the furthest point. Think about the map of Ukraine. Go to the furthest northeast point you can that's currently in Russian-held Ukraine. But from that point, go north 100 k's. That's where the airfield is. All to give you an idea of the extent of and the range of these drones. Now, the operations of the Novoshakhtinsk oil refinery in Russia's southern Rostov region, that is the oblast bordering Ukraine to the east. So from eastern Ukraine, the next one east, they were stopped. Operations there stopped this morning after drones fell on its territory. This comes from Regional Governor Vasily Golubev on Telegram. He said no casualties and damage was being assessed. So Russian MOD said that they'd shot down 65 Ukrainian drones overnight. So if they've shot them down and some others got through. I mean, you obviously take the numbers with a pinch of salt, but it looks like a very large series of attacks. Now, according to Russian MOD, Russian air defense shot down 1 drone over in St. Petersburg, 1 over Ryazan Oblast, that's the southeast of Moscow, 8 over Bryansk Oblast, 8 over Kursk Oblast, 12 over Belgorod Oblast and 35 over Voronezh. So those last 4 all bordering Ukraine to the northeast, and then obviously with the region to the east as well. So it looks like the nearest oblast to Ukraine got a bit of a pasting, and some further afield as well. Then staying inside Russia, Russia's MOD said that their security forces had killed 234 combatants whilst thwarting the border incursion yesterday that we talked about. So remember yesterday morning, it was said that several anti-Kremlin armed groups, including the Freedom of Russia Legion, the Russia Volunteer Corps, and the so-called, or the Siberian Battalion, I'm not battalion of what larger unit, I don't think that really matters. I don't think there is a large unit, but they're calling themselves the Siberian Battalion, crossed the border into Russia and conducted a number of combat operations. I don't know. I think we would have seen more social media footage if there was a force large enough such that 234 were killed. I think we would have seen more, so I think that's probably wrong. Then inside Ukraine, the overnight Russian drone and bomb attacks across the country, but in particular the eastern Sumy and Donetsk regions, have resulted in deaths and injuries. Local officials across the country are reporting this morning. So Russians bombed a town, Minarad, a town about 30 km northwest of Donetsk city, and Sumy Regional Military Administration said there were casualties as a result of a drone hitting an apartment block overnight. There's images on social media. It's taken a large chunk of the side and huge chunks out of the roof of an apartment block there. Clean-up operations still going on, and there's thought to be people under the rubble. The administration said 30 apartments of a 5-storey residential building were damaged, 15 of them largely destroyed, as I've just been describing. Now, down into the Black Sea, and Ombre Intelligence, that's the risk management consultancy that we keep an eye on, they report that another YAM-type pressure-triggered anchored sea mine was discovered and destroyed near Kabakum Beach. That's 5 miles north of the port of Varna in Bulgaria. This is said to have broken from its anchor chain. The sea mine was spotted 250 metres off the coast, and a Bulgarian Navy mine hunter was sent out to locate and destroy it. Footage of the operation is available. You'll find that. It shows the sea mine towed out to sea by a RIB, rigid inflatable boat, that had been just deployed from the mine hunter. Now, Ombre say that the sea mine showed significant levels of bioaccumulation on its surface, a bit like the one that was destroyed near Odessa a couple of weeks ago. And they say this indicates that it was likely in the water for a long time, probably from around the onset of the full-scale invasion. The controlled explosion of the sea mine confirmed it's obviously still active, and vessels navigating the Black Sea have been advised to limit sailing during periods of low visibility and to station lookouts on the bow of the vessel. Now, the one up in Odessa was thought to have been washed downstream by the destruction of the Novokhovka Dam. I don't know if this one, I don't know if the, not being an expert on tidal currents and what have you, I don't know if something that was in that region or possibly around the sort of Crimea coast, with the inflow of water having lost the Novokhovka Dam, I don't know if it would have got across to Bulgaria or if this is mines that have been laid elsewhere. But it was a viable device and is the second in, I think it was 2 weeks, wasn't it? But certainly in the last month or so. So there's probably more out there. And I'll take a pause there, David.
Thank you very much, Dom. Francis, let's come to you now. Diplomatically and politically, what's been happening today?
Thanks, David. In the context of Ukraine's weapon and ammunition crisis, welcome news for Kyiv today, with the US announcing a surprise $300 million military aid shipment for Kyiv after Pentagon accountants found savings in a budget many presumed exhausted. Effectively sidestepping Republicans in Congress, who have, of course, blocked that much larger package for Zelensky, Washington has announced more weapons to last for a short period, their term. The announcement came as Biden was preparing to host Poland's President Duda and Prime Minister Tusk, who came bearing warnings that Russia's aggression will not stop at Ukraine. The shipment includes, we understand, long-range US-made HIMARS rocket systems, anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapons, artillery shells and small arms ammunition. One senior Pentagon official said the savings for the package came from bulk orders of weapons in earlier shipments, which were delivered at a lower cost than expected. This ammunition will keep Ukraine's guns firing for a period, but only a short period, said Jake Sullivan, the White House's national security advisor. It is nowhere near enough to meet Ukraine's battlefield needs, and it will not prevent them from running out of ammunition in the weeks to come. Indeed, he added that the aid may only last a fortnight, leaving, of course, Kyiv outgunned on certain key axes of the front. As Dom reported yesterday, William Burns, the CIA's director, warned on Monday that without more aid from the US specifically, Ukraine could lose significant territory this year. That's a direct quote. While a threat assessment by the US's 18 intelligence agencies found the congressional deadlock was, quote, increasingly shifting the momentum in Moscow's favour. It's in this context, of course, that the leaders of France, Germany and Poland will hold emergency talks on Ukraine in Berlin on Friday, with more and more European leaders, including the Finnish Prime Minister only today, saying that the security of Europe cannot hinge on the outcome of the election in the United States in November. Much work is being done, as we've reported on, But it is the pace that remains a central question. Big decisions, particularly on weapons procurement, need to be made now in order for them to pay dividends later on. Another key question, of course, remains what the West collectively wants the outcome of this war to be. Is it to enable Kyiv to enter negotiations with Russia with the strategic initiatives on their side? That's what some argue. Or is it a total victory over Russia, liberating all of its sovereign territory? The reason that we keep asking this question on the podcast, and it was Dom who articulated it best in the video special that we recorded in Kyiv, is that it profoundly shapes the nature and pace of the weaponry Ukraine receives from the West. Thus far, it is President Macron of France who is the most prominent European leader trying to move the discussion forward with regard to what Europe's red lines are. But with so many disparate opinions, it is unlikely that the West will be able to collectively agree without steerage and reassurance from the top, which is why the absence of real clarity and leadership from the United States is such a tragedy. It has created a void of ambiguity and uncertainty that Putin has been able to exploit. As an aside, I can easily foresee a scenario form in the coming weeks and months where several European countries, most likely led from the Baltics, try to form some sort of military alliance, military pact, that says it would, in extremis, I hesitate to use that phrase, but in extremis, intervene militarily in Ukraine if certain territorial lines were crossed by the Russians, thereby forcing the hand of NATO powers and forcing a collective position to be found. There are ways, by the way, in which that can be done, if there were intervention, without triggering Article 5, by geographically defining the scope of the war. I emphasise both of these points because I don't see the current halfway house sustainable, not when you have so many members of NATO and the West seeing this war as existential for them. If it truly is, they cannot afford for Russia to make vast territorial gains in Ukraine, not 2 years into this war. So I know it may seem now outlandish to be talking about this, but if, as we've reported, the most pessimistic scenarios, and they are extremely pessimistic in my view, but if we were to even approach some of those, then these are conversations that will be happening very, very quickly indeed. And that is why Putin is trying to preempt them. He's talking about how any military intervention by US or other countries would have profound ramifications. In a major interview before the presidential election of the 15th, 17th, he reiterated that Russia was technically ready for nuclear war and that if US troops particularly were sent to Ukraine, it would be considered a significant escalation of the conflict. Again, just by raising the spectre of atomic weapons, many in Europe immediately balk without serious reflection. It's like a reflex. But imagine for a moment that Western soldiers did intervene militarily in Ukraine preemptively, saying this far and no further. I do not think there is any chance that Russia would attack those forces. But even if they did, and there was, God forbid, open warfare in Ukraine between Western forces, why on earth would Russia use atomic weapons on territory it wants to seize? Why, furthermore, would it threaten other European capitals when doing so would ensure its own destruction? It is illogical. But this conversation is never seriously had because its very nature makes people nervous. But as we've said before, that only increases the fear of the thing itself. And that fear is being used to manipulate the West to potentially devastating effect. Another interesting thing Putin said in this long rambling interview was that it would be ridiculous for us to start negotiating with Ukraine just because it's running out of ammunition. In other words, There is no longer a point for Putin to pretend he wants any negotiations now that he has a strategic advantage. Again, many said negotiations were only ever a ploy by Russia to buy time and cause a hesitation in weapons deliveries. It was quite something to hear Putin answer the question, how do we minimise losses when on the offensive, by answering simply more lethal weaponry. If only people in the West could see so clearly and succinctly in the Ukraine context what is required. To stress the urgency of the situation, Poland's capital, Warsaw, will spend £23 million, the equivalent of which, in the next 2 to 3 years on bomb shelters and other security measures. While Poland has reassured consistently its citizens that its place in the alliance ensures their safety from Russian attack, the invasion of Ukraine has prompted preparations for the worst-case scenario. Underground car parks and metro stations are among 7 million square metres of space that could serve as shelters, according to the city mayor. I mention this because did anyone really think 2 years ago that we would be reporting on such a story now, with increased, not decreased, anxiety in the European defence context? The West has clearly been hamstrung by indecision due to fear of escalation, which, ironically, is only increasing, not decreasing, that escalation and threat. To put it bluntly, Russia perceives itself as at war with the West. In that sense, we are already at war. It is that simple. But unfortunately, too many are still in denial about that stark fact.
Well, thank you very much, Francis. I know you've got more to say later, but Dom, do you want to come in on any of that and add your own thoughts?
Yeah, I was thinking, as Francis was saying, that the point that comes out of the this interview Putin's done, saying it'd be ridiculous for us to start negotiating with Ukraine just because it's running out of ammunition. I mean, that really is the mask slipping there. His maximalist aims have never gone away. His ability to do something about it may have done. Now, whether or not that means that he's going to reach for even more extreme measures, I don't know. I think, as I've mentioned yesterday, the whole reflexive control thing that Phillips O'Brien has been talking about, I think we're too eager to do that to ourselves. And I think it is worth having a serious discussion about what escalation might mean, and if that involves looking at your infrastructure in NATO countries and seeing if we are as prepared for the situation as Ukraine finds itself in, and we look at underground car parks and subways and metro stations, all the rest of it. I think that's another matter. It's a bit like the old argument about do you feel safer with a policeman on every street corner, or does that make you think, oh my God, this must be a high crime area, I'm at greater risk? So if we had military and civil authorities going out and openly looking at our own defences and maybe even investing in bomb shelters and what have you, would that make you think, yeah, brilliant, we're doing our bit, we're standing up for what we believe in? Or would Western societies now think, blimey, I'm not up for this, isn't what I was expecting, my stomach's not in this one? So it is a very tricky political question to be asked. Those to the sort of north and east of NATO alliance, the further north and further east you go, I think they're much more clear-eyed about it. I think Mr. Macron has been, I mean, we've given him, we've got our arms around him and then given a couple of kidney punches over the last couple of years as well. I think the swingometer at the moment is that he's saying the right things. I don't particularly care if it's for any kind of domestic consideration. I'm not sure it really is, although he's got a bit of an issue there with Marine Le Pen. But I think he's saying the right things for the right reasons. So Europe needs to have this conversation. Part of the downside of democracy is that these all happen in the open. Part of the upside of democracy is these things all happen in the open. Putin tries to turn that against us. I think it is right that we have these discussions. We think about, are we prepared to spend our own tax money on not just preparing for an offensive war, but also defending ourselves to a greater degree than we are already. I think many people, especially here in Britain, and I think in Western Europe, would be very surprised to have to start thinking about, well, what would I do if there was if there was an imminent threat? How would I know if I heard? How many people in this country have heard an air raid alarm So I think there's a lot of things that need to be discussed, and we discuss them here. I think Western leaders are starting to a greater degree, but it all starts with what do you want to happen here? It's almost as if many people in the West think that they are passive bystanders to this and that fate is just going to go one way or the other. I mean, it is in the gift is the wrong word, but the Western leaders and powers have the ability to provide Ukraine with the means to win this war. And equally, by not providing those means, it will almost certainly ensure Ukraine's defeat. So you can't just step back and go, oh, blimey, look at that. Fate's intervened and they've lost. We had nothing to do with it. You know, I've said it before, you can't be a little bit pregnant. We are in this. So it's about time you decided which way you want it to end. And if you're content with Putin winning this, and then you want to sort of fast forward to the bit and like, well, let's see if he has a go at Estonia and Poland and what have you. Well, can you make that clear now? Because otherwise there's going to be a lot more people dying between now and then until you're actually faced with the consequences of that decision, that indecision decision. So I think there's a lot going on right now in the political sphere, and they need to start having a conversation with the various societies across all these measures, because history has a sort of habit of coming and kicking you when you're least expecting it. Sorry, a bit of a ramble there, David, but yeah, it's worrying times and a lot to think about.
Not at all, thank you, Dom. Francis, with all the activity and noise coming out from France and Emmanuel Macron, are you in risk of maybe potentially saying something nice about the French?
God forbid. But although my name is Francis, after all, so it's maybe was there beneath the surface all along. It is extraordinary, isn't it, how things have changed from where we were at the beginning of the war. There were very early condemnations of the French position. I remember people were saying, why on earth is Macron speaking to Putin for so long? Subsequent revelations have said that Zelensky was pushing for Macron to continue a dialogue with Putin, although then, later, he said, please stop talking to Putin, it's no longer helpful, and Macron did continue. So there's been a lot of criticisms. I think bigger criticisms as well with regard to hesitancy on weapons deliveries in the first year of the war, certain unhelpful remarks that Macron made publicly. Then, of course, the relationship with China at a time when China were also seen as playing a very unhelpful role in the conflict. So it is interesting to see Macron's position evolve. I think that is partly due to domestic challenges. I think we need to be frank about that. I think also when you have a president or any political leader who is hamstrung domestically at home, inevitably their eyes turn abroad. It gives them stature, it gives them presence, and it also is a lot more, how do I put this, glamorous than trying to untangle knotty political issues at home. So I do think that plays a role. But I also think too that he has been well briefed on the evolving military situation, perhaps better briefed than many others in Europe about what the worst case scenario could mean. And as a response to that, he is now trying to vocalise the serious conversations that need to be being had about what Europe's red lines are, as I say. Because if we don't articulate them now, then they're going to be having to be made in a hurry and in a desperate hurry, and that's when you may have mistakes being made. And not only that, if we do articulate the red lines now, as we've said many times, then maybe there can be the prevention of disasters later down the road. So I am very willing at this moment, today, and who knows what will happen next week, to nod politely in Mr. Macron's direction. Certainly compared to, I would say, the leadership by Rishi Sunak at the moment in Britain and Olaf Scholz in Germany. He's doing a commendable job. But as ever, David, it's deeds, not words, that count.
That's an astonishing Francophile journey you're taking, Francis. It's very, very good to hear. And of course, if you are listening in France or a French listener, please do get in touch and let us know what you think about Macron's positioning and the French government's positioning. It's been very interesting to see it evolve over the past 2 years. I'm not sure actually how many listeners we do have in France, so do get in touch. It would be very good to hear from you. Donc, merci pour tout ça, Francis. I know you have one more update for us.
I do, David. Well, moving away from old Paris into the Russian orbit, we hear or reported extensively on the death of Navalny and its political ramifications in Europe and in Russia itself. And anyone who thought that the death of Navalny would be the end of Putin's war against those who oppose him have, I think, were sorely mistaken. One example of that is just in the last 24 hours, a long-time ally of Navalny was allegedly attacked outside of his home in Lithuania yesterday. This is Leonid Volkov, who said his arm was broken and his leg hit 15 times with a hammer. The alleged assailant is unknown, but Mr. Volkov said that it was politically motivated. He said it was an obvious, typical gangster greeting from Putin, from Bandit St. Petersburg. Mr. Volkov has lived outside of Russia for some years for his own safety and served as Navalny's chief of staff until the opposition leader died in prison last month. Furthermore, we know, following Navalny's funeral, that Moscow police detained some Russians suspected of attending that event after trawling through videos from the day. One Moscow resident was later arrested after police claimed that she was heard in the video saying "glory to heroes." Of course, a phrase very much associated with Ukraine. That's coming from OVD Info, an independent media outlet monitoring Russia. She was allegedly held overnight at a police station on March 4th and fined 1,500 rubles, which is about £13, for violating regulations against the display of forbidden symbols. More evidence, if needed, of that clampdown that is not just within the borders of Russia, but beyond it. That does not even surprise many of us anymore, but perhaps it should, because it speaks to a failure for us to condemn such activities over a very, very prolonged period of time. In Britain, of course, we saw the murder of Alexander Litvinenko by FSB operatives many, many years ago now, and not masses was done apart from very strong words. And then a few years later, we had the Salisbury attacks. So again, all of this speaks to a failure to make clear ramifications and clear red lines of such activities taking place, which, of course, enables said activities. If there had been much stronger words from the West, much stronger condemnations, then perhaps Navalny would still be alive. Perhaps he would be a free man. All of these equivocations have ramifications.
Coming up, Dom and Francis share their final thoughts. All right, let's go to final thoughts from Francis Dearnley first, please.
Thanks, David. I mentioned the Russian presidential election earlier, and I think it is just worth our reflecting on the fact that people in the occupied territories, Ukrainians in the occupied territories, are being compelled, in essence by force, to vote in these elections. The BBC has done a good report on this. It's called "Occupied Ukraine Encouraged to Vote in Russian Election by Armed Men." The headline says it all. So these are, of course, those 4 Ukrainian regions: Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk and Luhansk. And as the BBC writes, one resident complained of pro-Russian collaborators with ballot boxes going from house to house looking for voters, accompanied by armed soldiers. Others report the following being said quite vocally by people both in these regions as well as on social media by Russia-installed electoral commissions. "Dear voters, we worry about your safety. You do not have to go anywhere to vote. We will come to your home with ballots and boxes." I think they forgot to add the other B there, which is, of course, bullets. Ukrainians under occupation are also put under pressure for a pro-vote campaign called Inform UIK, ostensibly designed to inform them about the procedure of voting as well as all the candidates. It seeks to visit all remaining residents of Russian-occupied regions at home, and its representatives are often accompanied by armed men. They collect personal data to compile lists of voters and sometimes film local residents during such visits. Russia's electoral chief in the partly occupied Zaporizhia region acknowledged that some locals were worried about the filming. Just a snippet there of what is going on in the occupied territories in the run-up to this presidential election. Again, a term I use in the loosest possible sense. There are calls for countries to publicly declare the presidential election illegitimate before the results are announced. I think there'll be more on that in the coming days, because inevitably, whenever a leader secures another term, there are pressures applied on leaders to congratulate said leaders. And I think there will be many who will be extremely uncomfortable about that fact for perfectly logical reasons. So more on this to come, but let's not forget what is going on in those occupied territories. Information is often sparse, but what we do hear is often very concerning indeed.
Thank you very much, Francis. Dom Nicholls, would you like the very final words for today?
Yeah, thanks, David. Well, obviously, like everybody listening to this, I imagine, I often dream of helicopters, flying them. Why are you laughing, Francis?
Sorry, no comment.
Okay. Yeah, clearly we all dream of helicopters all the time, and that's an admirable and correct human response. So you will have noted, as I did, that the Army Air Corps, Britain's Army Air Corps, hurrah, is just retiring the Apache D model that has been in service for 20-something years, Sterling service in Afghanistan. So the D model is going, the E model is coming in. I think it's about the same. It's just a sort of, you've got to sort of chip off the D on the side and stick E on. It's probably a bit more to it than that, but that's about it. Anyway, got me thinking about close air support. So close air support being that the intimate support provided from the air to ground troops in contact. But very, very basically, that's my sort of quick sort of ready reckoner. So the Harrier jet was a close air support platform. The A-10 Warthog, close air support. So the Air Forces and others, Navy as well, and Army in some nation service, providing from the air that literally speaking to the people on the ground in contact with the enemy and bringing in fires very, very close on occasion. So close air support, the fight on the ground. So Apache was there for a number of roles, but that was primarily it, to be that intimate support. It was always described as a kind of flying tank because the thing it could do, the firepower it had, all the rest of it. I've been thinking about close air support recently in the context of what drones are doing to the battlefield here, first-person view drones in particular. Now, there's been a lot of talk about how drones are going to replace artillery. I don't think that's going to be the case. I really don't, but, answers on a postcard. We can have that discussion some other time. Close air support is a different matter. Now, there's a lot of other things that air forces do, and even Army or helicopter forces in operation with armies or air forces, but just that function of intimate support from the air to troops in contact on the ground. I just wonder if the advent of first-person view drones really is going to have an impact on that, on close air support. Because if you've got enough of them, and it's big if, but if you are able to negate the anti-drone technology so that the majority of your things can get through, then I just wonder if the effect that it can have on equipment, tanks and armoured vehicles, such as you would look to have from a Hellfire fire from an Apache. I wonder if first-person view drones, in the quantities that you're going to be able to field for the same cost of a big fleet of helicopters, notwithstanding all the personnel and all the other lines of development that you need to be able to develop a capability, and we've spoken about D-LODs in the past. I'm sure I'll get another run at that again. But just on cost alone, you get a lot more of these things than you will for a fleet of Apaches. And I wonder if if the juice is worth the squeeze now to have armed and inhabited assets. So something I've been thinking about, obviously, whilst doing all my little doodles of helicopters, putting Francis in a cockpit and me in a cockpit and all the rest of it. And but I would welcome anyone's thoughts on, so just on that bit of air power alone, close air support, where the first-person view drones really does bring that into question. Because then in the British model, that would really, if we're just moving from Apache D to Apache E, I've no idea what's going to come next, but I'm guessing it might start with F. But I just wonder if there's a huge cost saving, which would lead to a great organisational change and so on and so forth. But I wonder if now's the time to say here's a fundamental change to how we do an aspect of military activity, such as close air support. But I will leave that one with you, David, and I look forward to listeners' responses. Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our world affairs newsletter which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Giles Gear, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.